I feel so honored tonight to have the grand privilege of introducing to you Dr. Brian Blount. As many of you know, Dr. Blount is president of Union Presbyterian Seminary in Richmond, Virginia. It's a great school. Dr. Blount is a world-renowned biblical scholar who was this past year, he was the Lyman Beecher speaker at Yale Divinity School, which for seminary folks is the equivalent of playing at Carnegie Hall. While Dr. Blount is an excellent scholar, teacher, and preacher, he is also an exceptional example of spiritual leadership in action. And this is his topic for this evening. As a recent graduate of the seminary, I have had the privilege of personally experiencing Dr. Blount's spiritual leadership. When he arrived at Union as president, he faced a number of difficult challenges, many related to the recent recession, including everything from a declining endowment to a budget shortfall. In responding to these issues, Dr. Blount has embodied genuine spiritual leadership through his calm and non-anxious presence. He's also shown confidence and creativity in his spiritual leadership. Even though he has a tremendously busy schedule, I can personally say that he would always take time to meet with students and invite us not only to share our thoughts about the seminary and concerns, but also ask help for writing papers or a sermon, as well as help finding a call. Without any further ado, it is my privilege to introduce our 2012 Festival of Faith speaker, Dr. Brian Blount.
Thanks. Thank you. Thank you very much, Jim, for that wonderful and very warm introduction. It's very nice to see Jim and Marie, to be here with them, to see how well they're doing. And I know from the past experience of how our students, our graduates who have become Lake Fellows here have had such wonderful experiences. I knew that they would be having a wonderful experience as well. Thank you for the nurture that you give to the students of ours who come this way. We deeply appreciate it, and we tell of and sing your praises all the time in Richmond. So thank you. I also want to say how nice it is to be with Louis and Bunny. Louis, there they are. Louis has been such a wonderful friend for quite some time. We met at Montreat for the very first time. And I guess everybody meets somebody at Montreat at some point or another if you're Presbyterian. And since then, we have been just wonderful friends. And also Glenn, for all that he continues to do as he comes back and forward sometimes through Richmond. So it's always nice to be here with him. And many of you may know, some of you may not, that Bud Melton is now one of our trustees. So I get to see him a good many times during the year. So it's very nice to be here with Bud and with Chris. I want to talk, I want to make sure I have the right things on. You can hear me though, right? I want to talk a little bit about spiritual leadership. As you know, I'll be talking about Revelation most of my time with you, the book of Revelation, and I see that some of you are looking at the book, Can I Get a Witness? So tomorrow we'll talk about that. I'm going to talk a little about John of Patmos tonight as well as a spiritual leader. But then also preach from the text of Revelation on Sunday morning. So I hope that you will be full up with the Spirit as John was filled up with the Spirit by the time I get on the plane to go back home on Sunday afternoon. Just reading through the book of Revelation for me is always a bit of spiritual nurture because of John's own sense of how God was operating in his life. So I want to talk a little bit about what spirituality and spiritual leadership mean by looking at some biblical figures like John, also calling upon some of the events in my own life and how that's mattered to me as I've gone through living out a sense of call, hearing God's voice in my life and trying to follow and live into what God expects and hopes from me. Let me start with a story. Two of my closest friends are a couple from Trenton, New Jersey. For some time, the husband and I served together when I lived and worked in New Jersey. Every once in a while, they would get down to visit my wife and me. We had a nice visit only about a month ago, and during the visit, my friend was showing off his new toy, the latest iPhone, the iPhone 4S. Now, I don't know if the S stands for Siri, the automated voice that takes questions and responds with eerily accurate responses or not, but Siri certainly is one of the more prized features on the phone. You can ask Siri for directions, to play back text messages, to give you information about hotels, planes, trains, automobiles, any kind of thing you want to ask. Very impressive. Now, my wife had not yet seen the wonderful display of technology and technological wizardry that he had been showing me, so when she walked in the room, wanting to astound her right from the start, instead of asking Siri to read his latest email, he asked Siri a question. Siri, he said, chuckling proudly, "What is the meaning of life?" Just then the phone rang, and while my wife went over to answer the phone, Siri answered the question. The meaning of life, this is Siri, the meaning of life is a concept that provides an answer to the philosophical question concerning the purpose and significance of life or existence in general. I was flat out amazed. My friend, his wife, and I were laughing because we were so impressed, but my wife had missed the show, so when she hung up the phone, she asked, "Did she really give you an answer? What did she say?" Now, I later found out the answer that Siri gave us was the answer you find to that question in Wikipedia. Still, it was amazing to me that Siri had actually retrieved it. So then my wife said, do it again, let me hear it." But this time, machines being machines, Siri would not work right. At first, she couldn't hear what my friend was asking. He kept saying, "What is the meaning of life? What is the meaning of life?" And she kept hearing him say things like, "What is tonight?" Or "Where can I buy light bulbs?" Finally, exasperated, after asking Siri 5 or 6 times without getting any better recognition from her, with us protesting to my wife that Siri really had answered that question, Siri picked up what my friend was asking. He all but shouted. He was all but shouting at this point, enunciating very, very clearly, "Siri, what is the meaning of life?" And Siri responded, "I find it odd that you would ask this question of an inanimate object." Isn't that amazing? I guess she told us. Siri, the inanimate object, understood that you ought not ask spiritual questions or try to find answers about spiritual leadership from machines, no matter how sophisticated those machines are. We have all of us have these spiritual questions, and I don't think it's surprising that we often look to the tools we have created to make our lives easier to also answer difficult questions for us. After all, we have created computers that think faster and more broadly, and sometimes, especially where math and physics and science areas are concerned, even more deeply than many of us. But solving equations is easier than solving matters of the Spirit. Spiritual questions can only be explored by spiritual beings, by us. It is incredibly difficult to get answers to ultimate questions by appealing to penultimate resources, especially resources we have created from our own hands. The road to idolatry, I think, starts there. We simply cannot expect our creations to explain the meaning of our createdness, the essence of who we are. To find ultimate answers, we need to seek a connection with the ultimate source and guide and ground of our being. And no matter how smart she gets, the connecting point will never be a Siri. Now, I don't have an iPhone 4S, so I can't ask Siri to define spirituality or ask her what are the ways to prepare oneself for a spiritual form of leadership. I suspect if I did and she didn't chide me for seeking such an answer from an inanimate object, she'd again turn to Wikipedia. This is the definition there. Spirituality can refer to an ultimate or an alleged immaterial reality, an inner path enabling a person to discover the essence of his or her being, or the deepest values and meanings by which people live. Spiritual practices, including meditation, prayer, contemplation, are intended to develop an individual's inner life. Spiritual experience includes that of connectedness with a larger reality, yielding a more comprehensive self with other individuals or with human community, with nature or the cosmos or with the divine realm. Spirituality is often experienced as a source of inspiration or orientation in life. It can encompass belief in immaterial realities or experiences of the transcendent nature of the world. Well, that's a mouthful, and perhaps a little more complex, I think, than the answer needs to be. Because in the end, I don't think you can define spirituality as much as you can live and then show spirituality. And as spiritual leaders, I think that is our task. Not to define spirituality, but to show it in how we worship and in how we live. When I think, for example, of the most spiritual moments in my life, I don't come up with definitions, I come up with stories. When I think of the meaning of spirituality, I don't think of words, I think of people and the way they live their lives. When I wonder about spiritual practices, I don't just read a book, I listen and watch people talk about prayer and worship and contemplative living and how all of those things have impacted their lives. Spirituality is the nurture and living out of one's faith. That's why when I think of spiritual leadership, I don't think of definitions, I think of people, spiritual people. And since I am a biblical scholar, biblical people, faith people. Now, how are spirituality and faith related? It's almost like that classic conundrum, the chicken and the egg, which came first. Philosophically, it's hard to say which came first, faith or spirituality. As a leader or a follower, does one need to be spiritual to have faith, or does faith enable you to be spiritual? They're so integrally related, I don't think it's worth debating the question. Whichever comes first, I do believe, though, that spirituality, a lived spirituality, enlivens, strengthens, nurtures, and sustains faithfulness in just the same way that exercising enlivens, strengthens, nurtures, and sustains the human body. Spirituality, then, is the exercising of faith. I can see, feel, and emulate such spirituality not by reading and studying definitions, and not only by practicing spiritual disciplines, but by watching spiritual people and listening to and learning from, and then emulating their stories. And that is why spiritual leaders must live their spirituality so that others can see it and emulate it. In other words, emulate you. I have my own spiritual stories about those moments when I felt that in my life there was something more than just the physical me, that I was connected to someone more vast than myself. Scholars call these vertical spiritual moments. These are times when one feels a connection with the transcendent, the divine, with the movement of God in one's own life and one's world. These are the vertical moments of spirituality, the moments where you feel God's presence and hopefully find a way to respond to God's presence in your life. How does it happen? According to the New Testament, it happens through the work of the Holy Spirit. In the book of Revelation, John talks about the Holy Spirit, but he doesn't say the Holy Spirit. He talks about the 7 spirits of God that go out into all the earth. The Holy Spirit moving across and into and through the world in which we live, and into and through the people who inhabit that world. The 7 spirits symbolized by John in such a wonderful way by the 7 candles and the fire on the 7 candlesticks. One of the interesting things about that, when you think about how the Holy Spirit in John's mind is related to the church, if the churches are the candlesticks, the candelabras, and the candles, and the Holy Spirit is the fire, in John's understanding, the fire is continually powering the churches, continually lighting a path and a way for the churches. So the Holy Spirit becomes that relationship, that connecting point between God and the people in the church. Paul has a different kind of way of looking at it when he talks about the Holy Spirit. He talks about God's Holy Spirit and then how that Spirit indwells and connects with each of us. For Paul, we each have our own inner human spirits. And it is that inner human spirit that can connect to and speak with God. One of the things that I found interesting as I was reading material in preparation for talking with you this evening was this article by David Mossberg, Spirituality Research, Measuring the Immeasurable. You know, the whole idea of trying to measure spirituality, I don't think ultimately you can do it. That's like asking Siri what the meaning of life is, but he wrote an entire article on trying and showing how one might be able to do that. He talks about the fact that there are 378 references in the Hebrew Bible to the word ruach, or 146 in the Greek New Testament to pneuma, each of them referring to human beings as spirit. It goes on to say, the Creator breathed life into Adam, and he became a living soul. The word breath comes from the Latin spiritus, which means that which gives life or vitality. When we breathe in, that invisible breath gives life to our visible bodies, so it is with our spirit also unseen. Spirit, like the breath, transcends a person, but is part of that person. He then goes on to point out and talk about what Paul is doing as Paul writes to particularly the people in his Roman church. This is what he says. The Bible clearly teaches that humanity originated in creation by God as males and females made in God's image. Obviously, that image is not physical, for every human body is unique. However, we interpret and fine-tune that imago Dei. It is explained by Jesus, who taught that God is spirit. Therefore, our essence too must be spirit, a concept often interchangeable with soul in the body. What I like to suggest is that what's going on is that this spirit, that is that piece and part of us that is connected out of the creation story with God, that connects us with God, Paul says in Romans and Galatians that that is the part of us that God connects with and speaks to in a vertical way and enables the possibility of us living out spirituality in this human created existence. So it is built within us. We are, in essence, hardwired to be in relationship with God through our own human spirits that are able to speak with, connect with, and commune with God's Holy Spirit. That vertical relationship, that connecting point, is the essence of what spirituality becomes. John of Patmos gives us a sense of that when he talks about his own connection with God as he lives exiled on that island in Patmos. His life, as we know, is somewhat of a mess. The lives of his church people are messes, enduring the possibility of persecution if they stand up for their faith in a world that wanted people to proclaim and show faith for Rome and the Roman emperor. John, in the midst of all of this, sought continually God's presence. No doubt he had his own skills and abilities. He was a wonderful writer. Given all of his great imagery and rhetorical flair, I assume he was also a great preacher. Clearly, he knew how to build alliances as well. He had done so well as an organizer for the followers of Christ that the Romans felt they had to intervene to put a stop to all that organizing. And he was clearly a powerful evangelist, having created and sustained churches in areas where faith in Christ made a person a social outcast. He had skills. But he didn't turn to his abilities. He turned to God when he comes to this great moment of crisis. On the Lord's Day, he says at chapter 1, verse 9, and at the very opening of his work, he tells us he is continually at worship, at the work of prayer and connection with God. In other words, building up and nurturing his own spirit so that it can speak more in a connected way with God's Holy Spirit. The poetic presentation of his dreams and visions and the way he then connects those dreams and visions to the social circumstances of his people using poetry and hymn indicates that he appealed often to liturgy and used liturgy to build a worshipful relationship between him and God. And clearly, prayer and meditation are important to him, as he was able to turn his island exile into a powerful place of connecting with God's Spirit, so much so that the Spirit was able to transport him in ways that enabled a connection with God that few have been able to mirror before or since. In other words, what I do is look at John and see what he's doing and get a sense of what the picture of spiritual leadership is like. Worship, prayer, meditation, liturgy, hymnody, all of that, ways in which John engages in the building up of his spirit so that it can speak in a more powerful way with the movement of God's Holy Spirit. So worship becomes one of the key ways, but also personal meditation and discipline as well. In John's discussion of his work, we get the picture of a spiritual leader, and in his preparation for his own leadership of his churches, we see someone practicing the disciplines necessary to encourage strong spiritual leadership. From John, we know what they are, as I said: prayer, study, especially biblical study, knowing the stories and traditions so that you can emulate the people, particularly Jesus of Nazareth, chronicled in those stories and traditions, worship, meditation, confession. I think everyone knows what the spiritual disciplines are. Taking the time to focus on those disciplines to actually practice them is the difficult part. Finding the space and initiative to practice the spiritual disciplines we know are important. As I said, one of them is reading of the biblical text. Knowing the biblical text. How are we as spiritual leaders to help others practice that discipline of reading the Bible on a daily, continual basis? I won't ask the question of how many of us read the Bible every day and how many of us use that as a way of developing a sense of spiritual discipline. One of the things I did do about 3 months ago was preach and use an illustration I'd found from Pew Center Research and other places. How many American Christians, in terms of percentage, do you think poll surveys suggest know where the Sermon on the Mount is? What percentage of American Christians would you think would know that? Yeah, it's in 38%. For me, as a biblical scholar, that's kind of a surprising number. Because if one isn't reading something, the biblical text, to know something as common as a Sermon on the Mount and where it is, that means one isn't reading a great deal about what Jesus is doing and how Jesus becomes a model for spiritual leadership for each of us, and in being enabled from all of that to hear His message and His word for how we are to live our lives in connection with God. As a biblical scholar, what I want is everybody reading the Bible all the time, and I'd like you to read it in Greek and Hebrew if you can. But the key point is that you read it. That you read it because reading those stories gives you pictures and images of what spiritual leadership is all about, so that you can find ways to emulate what, for example, Jesus is doing, what John of Patmos is doing, and that you can bring those kinds of disciplines into your own life. I wanted to say a little bit before I went on to talk a little bit more about spirituality, to talk about some things that happened in my own life. One of the things that I have enjoyed doing since I was a pastor, was going into the sanctuary when there's nobody else in the sanctuary. And I can do that. I could do that because I was the minister of the church. I was in the church all the time. I could pick any time I wanted during the week and go up and sit and meditate. I do it now in Watch Chapel when there's nobody there. Because for me, that's one of the ways to reflect, to spend time, to think about how God is moving in your life, and to reach out, to try to take hold of the movement of the Holy Spirit in your life. It started with me growing up in a Baptist church. And in that church, I used to connect being in relationship with the Holy Spirit with goosebumps I felt during worship. Now, that's not a great measure. I know that's not a great measure. I've kind of grown out of that. But for me, hearing the message preached, being in the community of worship where people were struggling to find a connecting point with the vertical movement of God in their midst, for me, that was a way of recognizing that there was something greater than myself, and that I needed to be in touch with that presence greater than myself, which then leads me continually today to sit in sanctuary by myself, to connect with and commune with what God is doing. Getting that sense gives one an understanding, I think, that God is always close. That has astounded me because I've made a journey in feeling that closeness with God and moving from an understanding that I grew up with in my Baptist church in Smithfield, Virginia, of God being a rule maker, someone to be afraid of if I didn't do everything right or if I did something wrong, to a gracious, loving presence encouraging me to live my life to the fullest. I made that transition in my journey, my faith journey, and a great deal of it is because of those moments of being in communion with God and sensing something different than a rule maker, but someone drawing me in through grace and through love. Doesn't mean that I've lost the sense and the expectation that there is judgment, just that this sense of God's grace and love are so powerful that the fear of judgment no longer defines my sense of relationship with God. God is close. I saw it in the way my parents experienced God in their lives, their trust even in times when a more rational person might have given up trust. And all of that, I've been able to see people connecting with a vertical relationship with God and trying to emulate that relationship. But I will say that it hasn't always worked out in the most predictable of ways. Lewis was there when I was inaugurated to be president of Union Presbyterian Seminary, and I opened my talk with a story of my growing up. You know, one of the things I've always wanted since I was a little kid in Sunday school, because of growing up and feeling the goosebumps and all of those things, I wanted to be someone who was able to hear God's voice. You know, like God spoke to Samuel, Samuel, Samuel. Or Paul on the Damascus Road and seeing Jesus. I wanted to be one of those people. I wanted to be able to hear God distinctly say, Brian, this is what I want to do with your life. And to then be able to follow up upon that. So I used to pray for God to talk to me. And one night, I woke up in the middle of the night, and I was certain, I slept with my head under the covers, I was certain that Jesus was standing beside my bed. Now you would think, given everything I've been praying for, that the first thing I would do is throw back the covers and say, here I am, Jesus. But for me, it was an incredibly frightening experience, and I refused to pull the covers back because I didn't know what Jesus might want once I had a chance to really talk with him. For me, that relationship, I was young at the time, but that relationship of connecting with God and yet being afraid of what God wants remains kind of emblematic of how I understand this sense of spirituality. We want to be close, we want to be pulled in, and yet we know we're also a little bit frightened of what might be asked of us when God does pull us in. But that's the tension that keeps a sense of spirituality alive and fresh and powerful in one's life. And so that's what I have suggested to students across the years they try to cultivate. A sense of wanting to be near, but knowing that being near to God also puts one in a godlike kind of risk. The kind of risk that we see in Paul's ministry, in John of Patmos' ministry, and in Jesus' ministry. There are those who argue that this kind of a vertical relationship and connection with God that can be nurtured through disciplines like prayer and worship and meditation and other practices is different from and better than membership in an organized religious tradition. So we hear what has become almost a mantra for the generation of the early 21st century. I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious. In other words, I connect with the divine, I have a vertical relationship with the transcendent, but I don't need to join or attend a church. In her article, Faith Unbound, Why Spirituality is Sexy but Religion is Not, Millie Hemingway observes, this is her, the number of people who self-identify using the long popular phrase spiritual but not religious is still growing. In 1998, 9% of American adults told the General Social Survey they were spiritual but not religious. By 2008, it had risen to 14%. Among those ages 18 to 39, the increase was more dramatic, and 18% now say that they are spiritual but not religious. According to a 2008 Newsweek BeliefNet poll, the numbers are even more dramatic. This poll concluded that 24% of the United States population identifies itself as spiritual but not religious. How this distinction developed and gained such traction is difficult to say. Appealing to a Duke sociologist, Hemingway theorizes that the growth occurs not because people are less likely to identify as religious, but because non-religious people are more likely to say that they are spiritual. She even argues that part of the popularity of the phrase spiritual, not religious, is that it sounds and feels sexy. She even has data to back that claim up. A British social psychologist at Britain's Southampton University looked at 57 studies covering 15,000 experimental subjects and reported in the journal Personality and Social Psychology Review, that North Americans find intrinsically religious people, the spiritual people, desirable, but that the desirability decreases when people portray themselves as extrinsically religious, in other words, a part of some church tradition. Psychologist Jan Sinnott attempts to help by distinguishing between spirituality and religion. She argues that spirituality is our personal relationship to the sacred or the transcendent, that vertical relationship that informs all other relationships and gives meaning to our lives. Religion, she says, refers to the practices and beliefs of a particular faith system. This definition might give us a clue as to why spirituality seems sexier than religion. For the opposite of spiritual is, what would you think the opposite of spiritual is? What would you, if you guessed? Material, right? Spiritual material. One would think the opposite would be material. Hemingway makes the case that the word religion comes from the Latin religare, back, legare, to bind. So religion is associated with being bound. She goes on to argue, in that sense, defining oneself as spiritual, not religious, couldn't be more apt, reflecting a desire not to be bound by any rules, by any community, by any belief. So on the surface, it appears that to be spiritual is to be free of the rules of any particular faith tradition, and that apparently for many Americans that feels right. I would say that distinction is a false one. Spirituality is also about commitment. Relationship with God. A vertical relationship with God demands a recognition of God's lordship, and that recognition creates a pull on one's life. A religious community is a gathering of folk who have come together in their understanding of God's lordship and what that understanding demands, and have committed themselves to nurture their spiritual lives in ways that enable them to have the power and vitality to represent that lordship in the way they live their lives. In other words, charging up that vertical connection, charging up their spirits so they can more fruitfully and powerfully connect with that vertical connection of the Holy Spirit through their communion with fellow worshipers in a fellow community. Their religious faith lives together then become a visible representation of their spiritual connection with God. In this way, religious traditions are the corporate living out of the vertical spiritual connection that we have with God. Quoting a seminary professor, Hemingway notes that unfortunately, spiritual has in some sense come to mean my own personal religion with my own individual creed. But that is, I want to argue, a misreading of a vertical connection with God. Personal relationship with God always has been about relationship lived out in, with, and for community. And that brings us back to story, in this case, the biblical stories, whether the Old Testament or the New. The most powerful and inspiring spiritual stories are drawn from out of the context of community. Moses, Joshua, the prophets, the psalmists, Jesus of Nazareth, Paul of Tarsus, John of Patmos, all of them have a deep spiritual connection with God that is undeniable, and yet their lives are not lived in solitary with the freedom directed only at themselves. Their lives are lived in and for community, so much that the most spiritual figure of all time, Jesus, God incarnate, lived out his spirituality in such a way that he was bound to God's people just as surely as he was bound to that Roman cross. For John of Patmos, spirituality that lives itself out in leadership of a people in a social context gets them to act in the communal, social, and political and economic realms of life based on their relationship with God. What they believe about God in heaven is critical for how they live their lives here on earth. John, as the ultimate spiritual leader, wants his people to connect vertically, but he wants them to live that connection out horizontally. This horizontal part of spirituality is the piece that is often missing when people think of spirituality and spiritual leadership, it seems to me. Too often to think of spirituality is to think exclusively of myself and my relationship with God without acknowledging, as in the case of biblical spirituality, that relationship with God implies connection with God's people. Clearly, this is what the author of 1 John means to say at chapter 1, verses 20 through 21. Those who say, I love God and hate their brothers or sisters are liars. For those who do not love a brother or sister whom they have seen cannot love God whom they have not seen. The commandment we have from him is this: those who love God must love their brothers and sisters also. Vertical spirituality must flow into horizontal spirituality. In other words, a spiritual leader is also a prophetic leader. Author Joseph Nangle calls this horizontal experience of spirituality engaged spirituality. Nangle writes on American spirituality after spending some time in Latin America and looking at spirituality from the perspective of the impoverished and the disempowered. He concludes that from this Latin American perspective, American spirituality today seems too often to be spirituality all about me. And while one need not agree with all of his conclusions, and some of his political conclusions are certainly going to cause heartburn for some readers, I think his primary point is important. As one reviewer of his book correctly observes, Nangle recognizes that the vast majority of spiritual writers and practitioners focus on the individual. While if reminded, most people would perhaps recognize this fact, it feels like a proverbial slap in the face when returning from a culture with a much greater emphasis on community and one's spiritual journey within that community. What Nangle seeks to recover or discover in the case of American spirituality is a spirituality that emphasizes the action of the Holy Spirit in this messy, disorganized state of our world. In a word, he wants a spirituality that bridges one's private journey, on the other hand, and the suffering that determines the existence of so many, on the other hand. The Holy Spirit and the existence and suffering of others. He goes on to say that for Nangle, the great misunderstanding of the incarnation occurs when believers only consider Jesus to be active as a personal and interpersonal agent and ignore the social and political dimension of his ministry. And then he concludes that what is refreshing about Nangle's book is the effort to connect the world with that personal relationship with God that is often referred to as spirituality. Nangle's book, he says, would be ideal for students in Christian spirituality programs who often need reminders that a suffering world exists to which our spirituality must necessarily respond. You know, the last time I was with you, I talked about Jesus in the Gospel of Mark. Jesus is spirituality at its highest point. You know, the dove descending on him, God's voice and presence directly with him. That vertical connection is sure with Jesus. And yet, when Mark starts out in chapter 2, verse 1, going on to 3, verse 6, what is called the first controversy cycle of the Gospel of Mark, he starts his ministry by living out that vertical connection by touching lepers, by eating with the wrong kinds of people, sinners and tax collectors, and by breaking the Sabbath tradition when the Sabbath tradition is so legalistic that people can't satisfy their hunger on that Sabbath day. The vertical connecting with the horizontal engaged spirituality. In my own life story, I've been driven to this kind of connection between the vertical and the horizontal, and that's why in that book, Can I Get a Witness About the Book of Revelation, I want to look at John's visions, his connection with God through the lens of the civil rights movement in the African American and the American tradition, because I think the vertical and the horizontal connect in a wonderful way in looking at Revelation through that lens. I have seen how important prayer, study, worship, contemplation, and other spiritual disciplines are so important for a person's life. And I've also seen how important it is to connect that gift of being in close relationship with God with the power that comes from that relationship to make changes in our world. And my parents are, for me, the model of spirituality and spiritual leadership that is both personal and religious, intimate and institutional. Their deeply personal faith lived itself out in church as they pressed our religious community to live into its spiritual faith commitments. For them, there was no divide between what God did in their personal lives and what God called them in our church to do in our social and communal lives. The religious institution of Hill Street Baptist Church was a vessel to help all of us spiritual believers and followers of Christ make faith come alive, not just in our hearts, but in the structures and systems of the town in which we lived. I grew up in Smithfield, Virginia, in a segregated community until I went to the 8th grade. Though white kids lived all around me, I knew not a single white child by name, until the morning I stepped onto the campus of Smithfield High School for that first integrated school year. I remember how odd it felt to be in a world, no longer in a world where my parents knew most of the teachers and my teachers had great knowledge of and respect for my parents. We were, teachers, students, and parents, all part of the same church network. We in the black church and in the black schools had a Sunday school union that connected us, that we went to joint worship services that connected us, and there was social activism that connected us. Our pastors moved from church to church preaching and teaching, and because we followed them, we ended up sitting in pews beside people from other churches in our sanctuary and in their sanctuaries. My spiritual world and my social school world intersected all the time. But in that new integrated reality, things were different. For the very first time, I was in a world for which I had no prior connection, and I remember getting off the bus and feeling almost completely lost. Almost. What gave me a sense of courage in that context was the image I remember most still to this day of my parents. There are two images of my parents that will always be with me. This is the earliest one. When I was very young, and I walked into their bedroom without knocking and found myself utterly shocked to see what they were doing. My father was on his knees on one side of the bed, and my mom was on her knees on the other side of the bed. They were praying. I had seen them pray at the breakfast, lunch, and dinner table. I had seen them pray in church. I had never seen them pray in this personal way, surrendering themselves before God. They tell me often that the reason my dad, who never made more than around $14,000 a year in his entire work life, and my mom, who was a wonderful teacher's aide but did not get rich doing that, were able to put 3 children through college and encourage them that they could encounter and conquer any situations that came before them was prayer. Through all of their struggles and hours in growing up, they prayed. I don't know because I never walked in on them again, but I suspect that they still pray every night the same way. Sometimes still I will call them and ask them to pray, particularly for something in my own life. Since I've been president of the seminary, I've called them a lot with that kind of request. Because I believe that God hears their prayers in a particularly powerful way. I don't have any evidence to back any of that up. All I have is the image of them on their knees and the calm assurance it gave me to see them there. I took that vertical relationship they had with God with me when I walked to my first integrated class that morning, because I knew that even as I walked, my dad, working in the meatpacking plant, and my mom at home at that time, whatever else they were doing, I knew they were praying for me and my brothers. Their prayers led them to organize with our church and other churches in our town, led them to work with the school board, led them to involve themselves in critical ways in every level of county government. Their goal was to ensure that the integrated world my brothers and me and I and the other children of Main Street Baptist Church found themselves in would be as supportive and nurturing as my segregated elementary school had been. Their prayers materialized into social, civic, and even political action. Their secure vertical life with God pushed them to secure life for as many of God's children as they could. I have seen vertical faith lived out horizontally. I have seen spirituality be religious. And I'm here standing before you today, the person that I am, because of how my mom and dad understood and lived that kind of spirituality. It is their story that I think of now when I think of spirituality. I don't think of a definition. I see the picture of the two of them on their knees in my head. You could, if you want, think about images in your own and from your own life. Or you could think about biblical images. Images of Jesus at prayer. Images of disciples like Paul. One of my favorite is one that I used at the board meeting just a few weeks ago. It was the image of the Syrophoenician woman in chapter 7. Her story is a powerful story of moving from vertical to horizontal. Martin Luther calls her story the story of the woman who wouldn't take no, but turned no into yes. You remember that story. Jesus is tired. He's going to Tyre to escape all the crowds that have been pressing around him, asking him to heal, to feed the hungry, all of those kinds of things. And he wants to hide himself away, and this woman breaks in, and she says, I want you to heal my daughter who's back home and is possessed by a demon. And Jesus, who's just taken a few loaves of bread and fed 5,000 people, says it's not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the Gentiles, the dogs. And that woman, seeking this vertical relationship with Jesus, not backing away, says, yes, Lord. But the crumbs that fall from the table are still available to the dogs. And Jesus says, for this saying, you may go your way, your daughter is healed. For me, that's vertical and horizontal. Both Jesus and the woman, especially the woman, reaching out to God, to Jesus, hoping and getting not the message she wanted in return, but pressing that vertical relationship with Jesus, with God, and connecting in a powerful way, such a powerful way that this vertical relationship with God transforms the physical being of her daughter. That, for me, is what spirituality is about. For me, what spiritual leadership is about is each of us figuring out how to make that vertical become horizontal. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Blount. I think we have a few minutes for questions. And Jim and I are going to take microphones to each side of the room. And we're going to race to visit hands, okay?
I believe, am I on? Good, I'm on.
You're still on.
Okay.
You should be. Okay, John, here we go. Please speak into the microphone so we get you.
Thank you for being here with us, Brian. In your attempts at defining the differences or the similarities between spirituality and religion, if we were to take religion somewhat to mean the exercise by going to church and saying we're religious, and so much of that being the organized church,